everyone, I am Meryl Scalope.
And I am Axel Tumaob.
Welcome to our video reporting titled about NOVATION. So what is novation? Novation is the extinguishment of an obligation by the substitution or change of the obligation by a subsequent one which extinguishes. In other words, it is the total or partial extension of an obligation through the creation of a new one which substitutes it. So how can there be a total or partial extension of an obligation? According to Article 1291, obligations may be modified by Number 1. Changing their objects or principle. An example is, Simon agreed to deliver to Ben a car. Later, they entered into another contract whereby instead of Simon delivering a car, he would deliver 10 air conditioners. The obligation to deliver a car is extinguished by the obligation to deliver the 10 air conditioners. The change may involve in the principal terms of the obligation. Number 2. Substituting the person of the debtor. Example, if after the constitution of the obligation, both parties agree that Kat will substitute for Simon or that Dan will be subrogated in the rights of Ben, there is a personal novation. In this case, Kat becomes a new debtor or Dan a new creditor as the case may be. Lastly, subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Example, if the agreement of the parties is that Simon will deliver to Dan the 10 air conditioners instead of Simon delivering a car to Ben, then there is a mixed novation because the object of the obligation and the person of the creditor are changed.
Moving on, there are requisites of novation. Number 1, there must be a previous valid obligation. Number 2, there must be an agreement of the parties concerned to a new contract. Number 3, there must be an extinguishment of the old contract. And lastly, there must be the validity of a new contract. In fact, the requisites of novation are that you must have an existing valid obligation, because novation is where there will be a partial or total extension of the obligation by modifying it. Therefore, logic dictates one of the requisites there must be an existing valid obligation. Second, of course, it is the intention of the parties to modify the obligation according to the wishes of both of them. Third, of course, they will be extinguish the old obligation. And lastly, they will replace it with a new one. So next, kinds of novation. Novation can be classified based on the subject involved. Letter A. Real or objective. Novation is made either by changing the object or the principal condition. In other words, novation occurs when the object or the principal conditions of the contract are changed. For example, altering the terms of loan agreement or changing the goods being exchanged. Letter B. Personal or subjective. Novation by substituting the person of a debtor or subrogating a third person to the rights of the creditor. In other words, personal or subjective novation occurs when the person responsible for fulfilling the contract is substituted. This could involve replacing the debtor with a new person or transferring the rights of the creditor to a third party. And under this mode, novation would have dual functions. One, to extinguish an existing obligation, and second, to substitute a new one in its place, requiring a conflux of 4 essential requisites. For example, X obliged himself to deliver a particular laptop to Y. Subsequently, X and Y agreed that Z will substitute X. In this case, the old obligation where X is the debtor is extinguished because of the creation of a new obligation. That is, the new debtor now will be Z. It can also be agreed by X and Y that W will be subrogated in the rights of Y. In this case, the old obligation where Y is the creditor will be extinguished because of the creation of a new obligation, that is, W becomes the new creditor. Take note that if what is being changed is the debtor, the proper term is substitution. While if what is being changed is the creditor, the proper term is subrogation. Letter C. Mixed novation. Novation is made either by changing the object or the principal conditions and by substituting the person of the debtor or subrogating a third person to the rights of the creditor. In other words, mixed novation combines both aspects involving change to both the subject matter and the parties involved. It's like hitting two birds with one stone, altering both the terms of contract and the people bound by it. For example, X obliged himself to deliver a particular laptop to Y. Subsequently, X and Y agreed that instead of delivering the laptop, X will deliver two particular cell phones to W. Take note that there is a change in the person of the creditor and the object of the obligation. Moving on, novation can also be categorized based on how it's constituted. First, express or explicit declaration. It is expressed when the new obligation declares in the unequivocal terms that the old obligation is extinguished. In other words, express novation occurs when the parties explicitly declare the intention to replace the old contract with a new one. Second, implied or material incompatibility. It is implied when the new obligation is incompatible with the old one on every point. In other words, implied novation arises when the terms of the new contract are fundamentally incompatible with the old one. Overall, the main point regarding novation in relation to the Constitution is the distinction between express and implied novation. Express novation occurs when the parties unmistakably declare the intention to extinguish the old obligation, while the implied novation arises when the new obligation is incompatible with the old one on every point without the need for the explicit declaration. The emphasis is on the clarity of the intention and compatibility between the old and the new contract.
Number 3. As to extent or effect. A. Total or extinctive. It is extinctive when an old obligation is terminated by the creation of a new one that takes place of the former. In other words, when an old obligation is completely extinguished and a new one is created. Also, extinctive or total novation is never presumed. There must be an express intention to novate. If implied, it is necessary that the old obligation is completely suppressed by the new one. Dual function of extinctive novation. Number 1 to extinguish an existing obligation. It means to terminate or end a legal or moral duty that one party owes to another. This can achieve by payment or performance, fulfilling the terms of a contract by making a payment or providing the agreed upon service or product. Another, accrued unsatisfaction. A new agreement where one party agrees to accept something different from what was originally owed to settle the obligation. And lastly, confusion or merger. When the rules of the debtor and creditor are combined in one person, effectively canceling out the obligation. Number 2. To substitute a new one in its place. It means to replace something with another item or person as a replacement. B. Partial or modificatory. It is merely modificatory when the old obligation subsists to the extent that it remains compatible with the amendatory agreement. It means when there is only a modification or change in some principal condition of the obligation. And also termed imperfect or improper novation. The obligation still remains in the force except insofar as it has been modified. Should there be any doubt as to whether the novation is total or partial, it shall be presumed to be merely modificatory. Lastly, number 4. As to origin. A. Legal. Legal novation which take place by the operation of law. It occurs automatically without the explicit agreement of the parties involved. It occurs when a new contract or obligation replaces an existing one, resulting in the discharge of the old obligation. Common examples include the replacement of a debtor or the substitution of a new contract for an existing one. D. Conventional. Conventional novation which takes place by stipulation of the parties. Conventional novation happens when both parties involved agree to replace an existing obligation with a new one. This type of novation is based on the stipulation or agreement of the parties, rather than by the law or court order. In this process, the original obligation is extinguished and a new one takes its place. It is important for both parties to clearly understand and consent to the terms of a new obligation for conventional novation to be valid. Moving on to Article 1292. In order that an obligation may be extinguished by another which substitute the same, it is imperative that it be so declared in unequivocal terms, or that the old and the new obligations be on every point incompatible with each other. So our point here is that to have an extinction obligation through the replacement or substitution of a new obligation, it must be declared clearly and clearly by the new substitute of the new debtor in place of the original one. Example, let's say Ross owes Rachel $1,000. Instead of paying Rachel directly, Ross agrees to paint Rachel's house as payment for the debt. In this example, the old obligation owning $1,000 is substituted by the new obligation, which is painting the house, and the both obligations are incompatible with each other because they involve in different forms of payment. So let's talk about Article 1293. Novation which consists in substituting a new debtor in the place of the original one may be made even without the knowledge or against the will of the latter, but not without the consent of the creditor. Payment by the new debtor gives him the rights mentioned in Article 1236 and 1237. So let's discuss in detail that when changing the debtor, it is not necessary to have the consent of the debtor. It is not necessary to inform the debtor. We can change the debtor even if he does not want to, but we cannot force the debtor if the creditor does not want to. Example, let's say Joey owes money to Phoebe. Instead of Joey paying Phoebe directly, Chandler steps in and agrees to take Joey's debt. If Phoebe agrees to this substitution, novation has occurred. Now, Chandler has become the new debtor, and his payment to Phoebe will give him the same rights as mentioned in Articles 1236 and 1237.
Next, kinds of personal novation. There are two kinds of personal novation. First, substitution. Substituting the person or the debtor. In other words, this involves replacing the person who owes a debt or obligation with another person, effectively transferring the responsibility from the original debtor to a new one. For example, if Alice owes Bob $100 and Bob agrees to accept Charlie as the new debtor instead of Alice, this would be a substitution of the debtor. Second, subrogation. Subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. In other words, this involves replacing the creditor with a third party who assumes that the rights and the obligation of the original creditor. For instance, if Alice owes $100 to Bob and Carol pays the debt on behalf of Alice with Bob's agreement, Carol becomes the new creditor and Alice's obligation shifts to Carol. Overall, both kinds of personal novation involve the substitution of one party with another in contractual relationship, either as a debtor or the creditor.